Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel, and Mirz Hashem, today we will be learning Daf Kuf Nun Ches Amud Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today on the very bottom line, the very last few words in the Shulchan Aruch on Daf Kuf Nun Zayin Amud Beis, Siman Shin Chav Hey Sif Dalid. Our learning today should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, Hanasinu Batzaru Bashivya, Ha'imdim Bei Bayom Ubein Bayabasha, Hamakim Yerachem Aleihem, V'yetziim Mitzar L'Rvacha Me'afela La'ira Mishibad L'Geula, Hashta Bagalo V'zman Kariv V'Naimar Amen. Our learning should be a schus for Shalema, for Yeshua Levi ben Ahuva Malkachana, Yitzchak ben Tzion ben Dusha, Rivka Bashir Leah, and Chava Hadassah Basero. They should have a refuah Shalema b'Sarg Shar Chel Yisrael in the schus of limud Torah of Klal Yisrael. We ask that the Rebbeinu Shalom should have Rachmanus and should watch over every member of Klal Yisrael b'chol makom shehem. Okay, so a brief recap of what we've seen so far here in Sif Dalet. The Mechaber has been discussing the case of an Eino Yehudi who went ahead and baked pas. He baked bread on Shabbos. Now, when he baked this bread on Shabbos, he did it totally for his own purposes. He's a commercial baker, and he went ahead and he baked bread so he should have bread to sell in his store. But he did it completely for his own purposes. He did not do it for a Yisrael in any way, shape, or form. The question is, what is the status of that pas? Is a Yid allowed to use that pas on Shabbos? Could you eat that bread on Shabbos? The Mechaber brought down a machloikis. He brought down a yesh oisrim and a yesh matirim. We learned in the Mishnah Berurah yesterday that the rationale for the yesh oisrim, the Chavetz Chaim gave us two different reasons why the yesh oisrim would say that this pas is aser. In both cases, the iser is an iser d'Rabbanan. The first pshat that the Mishnah Berurah brought down, he told us that the reason to aser this pas is because of muktzah. We know that whenever we look at the muktzah status of an item, we always want to know what the status of this item was during the Bein Hashmashos period when Shabbos came in on Friday evening. So let's do the math. If this bread was baked on Shabbos, so what was it on Erev Shabbos during Bein Hashmashos? If it was a 5-pound sack of flour and it was, some yeast and it was some water and some salt and maybe some eggs and maybe some fat, in that case, a lot of these ingredients were muktzah during the Bein Hashmashos period. Raw flour is muktzah. Even if the flour had already been taken and already been kneaded into raw dough is muktzah. These are not things that are roy la'achila. These are not items that people eat the way they are. So during the Bein Hashmashos period, the ingredients of this pas were muktzah. Therefore, now on Shabbos, after the Ein Yehudi takes the ingredients and bakes them into pas, it remains muktzah because of the rule of kevin migui de iskatzoi lebein Hashmashos iskatzoi lekulei yuma. Since it was muktzah during the Bein Hashmashos period, it remains muktzah for the entirety of Shabbos. That was one pshat that the Mishnah Berurah brought down for the Yesh Oisrim. The second pshat the Mishnah Berurah brought down was that this is actually a gzeira midrabanan. What's the gzeira? The gzeira is, if we are going to allow you to use pas that was baked by an Eino Yehudi on Shabbos, another Shabbos, you might come to the Eino Yehudi on Shabbos and ask him to go ahead and bake bread for you. That would be Amira La'akum on an Isser Daraisa, and that would certainly be Aser, and therefore the Chazal made a Gzeira, and they said, we're not going to allow you to use the bread that he baked on Shabbos. So that was the Yesh Oisrim. Then we had a Yesh Matirim. The Yesh Matirim disagrees with both of these rationales. As far as the Gzeira D'Rabbanan, the Yesh Matirim says we already find a precedent, a case where we do not make such a Gzeira. And that is, we know that if an Eino Yehudi lights a ner for himself, he lights a lamp for himself to have light, we know that Yisrael is allowed to have hana from that ner. And we don't make a Gzeira. We don't say that if we allow you to enjoy the light of the ner, you may come to ask him on another Shabbos to light a ner. So we have a precedent where such a thing is mutter, and the Yesh Oisrim, they say that no, there's a difference between a ner and bread. When it comes to food, people are lohut acharov. People very strongly desire food. So by food, the Eish Yisrael says we would make such a gzera, even though we don't make such a gzera when it comes to something like a ner. But the Yesh Matirim say no. The same way we don't make a gzera by a ner, we also would not make a gzera by pas. And as far as the question of muktzah, the Yesh Matirim say, no, this is not muktzah. Why is it not muktzah? Very simple. Because again, let's look at it during Ben Hashmoshes. You want to say that since the flour was muktzah during Ben Hashmoshes, since the dough was muktzah during Ben Hashmoshes, or, I neglected to mention earlier, or maybe you want to say that it's a case of noilad. You want to say that this is bread that wasn't in existence during Ben Hashmoshes. So now, migud is katzoyle Ben Hashmoshes is katzoyle kula yuma. The Eish Matirim say, no, that's not a valid argument. Because the whole underpinning of the Isser of Muktzah is that something was cast aside for Shabbos use. So if something was not available for Shabbos use at all during the Ben Hashmoshes period, it remains muktzah for the entirety of Shabbos. But the Eish Matirim argue, and they say this flour was not cast aside from Shabbos use. The Yid knows that it is b'yechilis of the Eina Yehudi. It is within the capabilities of the Eina Yehudi to go take the ingredients and bake them into bread, bake them into pas for Shabbos use. And therefore the Yisrael is not maktzeh daitoi minei. He doesn't separate his mind from these ingredients, and therefore the Eish Matirim hold that this isn't muktzah. Now, against that backdrop, let's continue here. Sif Dalid, the bottom line, Kuf Nun Zayin Amud Beis, says the Mechaber, Ubishas hatchak, under pressing circumstances, oil tzarich mitzvah, or if there is a mitzvah need, kigoin, for example, sudas bris mila. Let's say there's a bris on Shabbos, and you need to make the suda, and you need pas, you need challah for the suda. Oil tzarich berkas hamoitzi. Or if you pashut don't have challah to make a hamoitzi for the Shabbos suda, so these would be two cases of tzarchei mitzvah. Yesh lismaich al hamatirim. You could rely on the yesh matirim, and if the only pas that you have access to is the pas that an Eina Yehudi baked for his own purposes on Shabbos, you're allowed to go ahead and use that pas. Hagah, the Ramah says, Avol, even in these cases, also lite loy mois me erev Shabbos, sheyite loy pas b'Shabbos. Even in such circumstances, you would not be allowed to go to the Eina Yehudi on erev Shabbos and say, look, I'm going to pay you now for bread that I'm going to take from you on Shabbos. The Oz adaita di Yisrael ka'avad. Because once you go ahead and you make that arrangement with the Eina Yehudi before Shabbos, now the Eina Yehudi is actually going to bake that pas for you on Shabbos. And that's going to create a much bigger problem. Now suddenly we're not just talking about pasta that Eina Yehudi baked for himself. Now we're talking about pasta that Eina Yehudi actually baked for Yisrael, which is going to be a bigger problem. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Yud Ches, on the bottom of Kuf Nun Zayin Amud Beis. Ubishas hatchak kigoin. What would be a case of a shas hatchak? Shedar bakfar yichidi. Let's say you have a yid who is the only yid living in a small village. He doesn't have a neighbor that he could go to borrow challah for Shabbos. The only challah that he's going to have is if he gets pas that was baked by an Eina Yehudi on Shabbos. Eis katan yutes. So if it's a shas hatchak or tzarchei mitzvah, you could be samech al hamatirin. Says the Mishnah Berurah, mikamakim. Nevertheless, even if we're going to be maker like the matirim, yizayir, you should take care shalei likra yoisai lebeisai lefraya loidamav. You certainly cannot have the Eina Yehudi come to your house so that you should pay him on Shabbos to have a mekach memkar. That would mamish be an issa d'Rabbanan of mimtzai chefzecha. That would be doing business on Shabbos, which is totally awesome in d'Rabbanan. V'ayin le'el b'simin shin chav gimel sif dalid huva beveis Yosef. The Ramah said you cannot make an arrangement with the Eina Yehudi on Erev Shabbos so that you give him money on Erev Shabbos so that he should give you pas on Shabbos, because then he's going to bake the pas actually for you. Does that also l'divrei hakoil afilu l'tzarich mitzvah? Okay, now let's move along to Sif Hey. Now, in Sif Hey, we're going to see a very interesting thing. In Sif Hey, we're again going to talk about the Eina Yehudi doing malacha on Shabbos. And the question is, are you going to be allowed to make use of the product of the Ein Yehudi's malacha? And right away, we're going to see that there's a difference in halacha between Sif Daled and Sif Hey, and we're going to have to explain why that difference exists. So in Sif Daled, we were talking about an Ein Yehudi who bakes bread for himself. Now let's go to Sif Hey. Says the Mechaber 3 lines down, Kuftim Ches Amud Aleph, Eina Yehudi shetzad dogim. If an Eina Yehudi goes and he goes fishing and he catches fish for himself, catching fish is an Issa Daraisa. It's an Av Malacha of tzad, trapping. Oy liket peiros la'atzmai. Or he goes and he picks apples. He picks fruit for himself. That's also an Issa Daraisa. He went ahead and he did the Issa of Toilish on Shabbos. So right away, the topic of Sif Hey is very similar to the topic of Sif Daled. In Sif Daled, the Ein Yehudi did an Issa Daraisa for his own purposes. He baked bread. That's the Av Malacha of Mevashel. Even though Mevashel means to cook, baking is included under the rubric of Mevashel. So in Sif Daled, the Ein Yehudi did the Issa Daraisa of Mevashel. And we had this machlokes, a yesh oisrim and a yesh matirim. Here in Sif Hey, we have an Ein Yehudi either doing the Issa Daraisa, the Av Malacha of Tzad, or doing the Av Malacha of Toilish. What's the halacha, says the Mechaber? Asurim li Yisrael. The fish, the peiros, the fish that the Ein Yehudi caught, or the peiros that the Ein Yehudi picked, are aser to a Yisrael. And over here, the Mechaber does not bring down a machlokes. Over here, we don't find a yesh oisrim and a yesh matirim. Over here, it is completely aser. Let's take a look right away in the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Chaf Aleph. Shetzad dogim. The Ein Yehudi went and caught fish. He trapped fish. Says the Mishnah Berurah, ubazeh, in these cases, kulei alma moidu da aser. Over here, there is no yesh matirim. Over here, everybody holds it's aser. Now, first of all, why is it aser? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Mishum dehu vadai muktzah, because in this case there is no shaila. If an Ein Yehudi caught fish on Shabbos, that fish is going to be aser because of muktzah. Sheni tzoidu b'Shabbos. These are fish that were trapped on Shabbos. V'loy hayu mizumanim me'esmail, and they certainly were not muchan. They weren't prepared for Shabbos use before Shabbos. They were caught on Shabbos. How could you say that they were muchan before Shabbos? The Cholshkein, certainly, ha'isrim gam b'pas b'sif daled. Certainly, according to the yesh oisrim by the pas in sif daled, so then, of course, the fish are aser. But the point of the Mishnah Berurah is that over here, where we're talking about catching fish, over here there is no yesh matirin. In Sif Daled, we had a machlokes. We had an opinion in Sif Daled, the yesh matirin, who said that the pas is not muktzah. And this is why I went to great lengths to give the recap at the beginning of this year. Now let's remember, why do the Yesh Matirim say that the pas is not muktzah? Because they argue the flour, even though the flour was not edible during the Bein Hashmashos period, it doesn't matter. It still really wasn't muktzah. It wasn't cast aside from Shabbos use, because when Yisrael looks at that 5-pound sack of flour that's by the Ein Yehudi, he knows that the Ein Yehudi can go ahead and bake it into pas on Shabbos. So therefore, the 5-pound sack of flour is muchan on a certain level. You see, a Yisrael is not allowed to bake challah on Shabbos, right? So by a Yisrael, if a Yisrael has a 5-pound sack of flour, it's muktzah during Ben Hashmashos, and it's muktzah for the entirety of Shabbos, because the Yisrael is maktzah daitoi. He removes his mind from any possibility of using that flour over the course of Shabbos. But when it's a 5-pound sack of flour that belongs to an Ein Yehudi, that's not true, because the Yisrael knows that the Ein Yehudi could take that flour and transform it into pas on Shabbos, and then it will be available for him if it's not muktzah. So therefore, the argument of the Yesh Matirin is that it's not muktzah. But you can't make that argument by fish, because by the 5-pound sack of flour, the Ein Yehudi had the 5-pound sack of flour in his possession at the beginning of Shabbos. And therefore it's not muktzah, because the Yisrael knows that he could transform it into bread on Shabbos. But by the fish, the Ein Yehudi didn't have the fish during Ben Hashmashos. During Ben Hashmashas, the fish was very happily swimming around in the sea. So you can't go ahead and make an argument that fish was muchan for use. What are you going to argue? You're going to say, well, the Eini Yehudi could go ahead and trap it. First of all, how do you know that he's going to trap that fish? There's 5 billion fish in the ocean. So what, all the fish in the ocean are muchan because a guy could go ahead and trap it? That's a very specious argument. Also, there's a very big difference between when something is mamish in the hand of the Eini Yehudi and it's not in the hand of the Eini Yehudi. And therefore, in this case, by the Eini Yehudi that catches fish, we do not have a yesh matirin. Everybody holds that fish is aser. Continues the Mishnah Berurah Kan Chaf Aleph. V'lav dafka shetzadon Eini Yehudi. Even though the Mechaber gives us this halacha in the context of an Eini Yehudi who goes and catches fish, says the Chavetz Chaim, that's lav dafka. Dehu adin im nitzodu me'alein b'Shabbos b'hametzuda sheparsu me'erev Shabbos. Let's say a yid puts out a net on erev Shabbos to catch fish, and a fish gets caught in the net on Shabbos. That fish is also aser on Shabbos because again, it was muktzah during Ben Hashmashas. Migud is katzoi le Ben Hashmashas is katzoi lekule yuma. Mishnah Berurah is Kanachav Beis. So one case over here was an Eini Yehudi who catches fish. The next case was an Eini Yehudi oiliket peiros, or if he performs the malach of toilish and he picks fruit. Says the Mishnah Berurah, that's also aser gamkein mishum muktzah. The apples are going to be aser because of muktzah. The mechubarin hayu ben hashmashas. Again, these apples are muktzah migudis katzoy ben hashmashas because during the ben hashmashas period they were still attached to the tree, and they remained attached to the tree for the duration of ben hashmashas. Now, while they're attached to the tree, they're not available for Shabbos use because the only way you could get them is by doing toilish, and you're not allowed to do toilish. So they were muktzah during ben hashmashas. They remain muktzah for the entirety of Shabbos. V'gam. And then, says the Chavetz Chaim, there's another reason why the peiros that were picked by the Eini Yehudi are going to be aser on Shabbos. V'gam de gozminon bazeh shemeyala v'yitloish. There's also gzera d'Rabbanan. If we would allow a Yisrael to make use of apples that were picked by an Eini Yehudi on Shabbos, what might happen is, now suddenly it comes out that a Yisrael looks at an apple on a tree on Shabbos as being available, right? If the halakha is going to be that if Tony goes ahead and picks an apple off the tree, you're allowed to eat that apple on Shabbos, so then suddenly you look at the apples on the tree as not being totally removed from Shabbos use. You know, what do you mean? Last Shabbos, Tony picked me a delicious apple. So now the next Shabbos, we're afraid that the Yid might himself go and pick an apple off the tree and be over the Yisra Daraisa of Toilish. So we have Gzera D'Rabbanan. Kemoisha Gazra Peres Hanoishri B'Shabbos. And we already saw a precedent for such a Gzera. We know that apples that fall off the tree on Shabbos are aser. If you see a beautiful ripe apple fall off your apple tree and it's laying on the floor on Shabbos, you're not allowed to go pick it up and eat it. Why? If we're going to allow you to eat that apple, you might then come to go ahead on the tree and go ahead and pick an apple. Mishum da adam lohot acharehen, because people have great desire and great craving for food, and that's why we are worried. V'gam b'kalhu l'tolshan, and also all it takes is a flick of the wrist to go ahead and pick an apple off the tree. It's something that it's very easy to transgress, and therefore the Chazal made such a takana, such a gzera. V'hu adin kan shenitlashu al yedei Yehudi, the loy geri, the shteim nitlashu shalai al yedei Yisrael. Both in the case where the apple fell off the tree, or in the case where Tony went ahead and picked the apple. In both cases, the apple became separated from the tree, not through the maleches iser of Yisrael. And in both cases, Chazal said it is aser. Aiskan Chav Gimel, Asurim li-Yisrael. The fish, the peiros, are aser to Yisrael. Points out the Chavetz Chaim, what does that mean that they are aser? It means bein ba'achila, bein betiltel. Not only are you not allowed to eat them, you're not allowed to move them. They are muktzah. Going back to the Mechaber, 4 lines down in the beginning of the line, says the Mechaber. So we have said that if an Eini Yehudi catches fish, or if an Ein Yehudi goes and picks fruit on Shabbos, they are osir to Yisrael, both ba'achila and betiltel. Says the Mechaber, va'afilu safek im likton oitzadan hayoim. Even if you have a safek, you go into the Ein Yehudi's shop or into the Ein Yehudi's house, and you see apples, and you don't know, did he pick them on Shabbos or did he pick them on Erev Shabbos? You have a safek. Says the Mechaber, afilu safek im likton oitzadan hayoim. Even if it's only a safek that maybe he picked it today on Shabbos, asurim by b'yoim, they are osir for use on Shabbos. Aval erev, but on Motzei Shabbos, mutarim miyad, they become immediately mutar upon Ois Shabbos. You do not have to wait for the zman of bichdei sheyeyasu. You don't have to wait for the amount of time it would take the Ein Yehudi to go to the tree and pick the apples. They become mutar. The second Shabbos is over. Afilu im vadai likdan v'tzadan hayom, and that's true even if we know for certain that the Ein Yehudi picked the fruit or caught the fish on Shabbos itself. So the two halachas that we just said over here in the Mechaber, first of all, you should know, even if you only have a suffix whether or not the Ein Yehudi picked the fruit or caught the fish on Shabbos, it's possible that he picked them on Erev Shabbos, they are still osir. So they're osir misafik. Now we're going to have to explain why, because let's remember, we're dealing with Yisirei D'Rabbanan here. Normally the rule is Sveika D'Rabbanan L'Kula. So over here when we have a suffix and an Issa D'Rabbanan, why is it that it's osir? We'll answer that in the Mishnah Berurah. The other halacha that the Mechaber said is, while these peros and these fish are osir on Shabbos, they become mutter immediately upon Ois Shabbos. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Katan Chav Dalet, Va'afilu suffix, even if it's only a suffix, even if we only have a question that maybe the apples were picked on Shabbos, they're still osir. Explains the Mishnah Berurah in 3 words. The reason for this is the suffix muchan osir. When we have a suffix, whether or not something was considered muchan or muktzah, it is osir. Now the Mishnah Berurah over here doesn't explain why. Before the end of this year, we'll see another Mishnah Berurah where he does explain why, but I'll give you the heads up. The answer is because of a rule that we've already discussed many times in the context of the halachas of bittul. We know that a davar sheyesh loy matirin, something that is automatically going to become mutter with the passage of time, afilu be'elef loy batal, it's not batal even in 1,000. Why? Because if it's going to automatically become mutter on its own, if just with the passage of time it's going to become mutter, why should we employ bittul to make a davar osir mutter? The same reasoning goes over here. Over here we're dealing with muktzah. Muktzah automatically becomes mutter upon the end of Shabbos. So it's a davar sheyesh lo matirin. So why should we turn around and be matir it misafik? We have a doubt. Maybe the guy picked the apple on Shabbos. Maybe he picked it on Erev Shabbos. So you want to employ the rule of Sveika D'Rabbanan L'Kula. You want to be makel, and you want to be matir the apple. Why should we? It's a davar sheyesh lo matirin. Wait until Motzei Shabbos and it'll be mutter then. And you'll use it then in 100% status of heter. That's why. Continues the Mishnah Berurah. Va'afilu hamatirin lekaman b'sif zayin b'safik le'inyan Motzei Shabbos. Even, we're going to see Mir Hashem in Sif Zayin, that there are those that say that when there's a suffix, whether or not something was done for Yisrael. So now we have a question. Is this item, does it become mutter immediately upon the end of Shabbos, or do we have to wait? B'chtei sheyeyasu, even according to the Mekilim later on in Sif Zayin, Pazeh Moidu, over here, they are Moideh, that even misafik this is aser ukid l'kameh. V'dafka b'safik hu da'aser. Now, says the Mishnah Berurah, when I'm telling you that it's aser misafik, this is only if you really have a suffix. V'dafka b'safik hu da'aser, the talina de b'yayim nitzaydu v'nitlishu. When we have a real suffix, and it's a real possibility that the apple was picked on Shabbos, then we're going to go l'chumrah, and we're going to assume that it was picked on Shabbos. Aval, if there's really no suffix, im nikr de nitlishu me'erev Shabbos, if by looking at the apple, you could tell that this apple wasn't picked today, ki goin perish and nichmishu. If you look at an apple and it's already starting to dry out, it's already shriveling, you know that this is not an apple that was picked today. So then you don't really have a suffix. V'chein bedogim b'kai gav nashari. Or if you look at a fish and you say, that ain't no fresh fish. So then you don't have a suffix. So was treatment can cup. If you don't have a suffix, then you could assume that it was picked on Erev Shabbos, it was trapped on Erev Shabbos, and then you do not have to be machmir. Ukid l'kamam b'simin tafkuf tesvav ayin sham b'beis Yosef. Ois katan chavhei. The Mechaber said that by these peiros, by these dogim that were picked on Shabbos by the Eini Yehudi for his own purposes, they become mutter immediately upon the end of Shabbos. La'erev mutarin miyad. Explains the Mishnah Berurah a very important rule. Dedavka kisha asa hamalacha b'shvil Yisrael. It's only when an Eini Yehudi performs malacha for a Yisrael. Who the gazru lesar be'erev ad kadesha yeyasu kidel kamei b'sif sha'achar zeh. That's when we employ a chumrah and we say, if an Eini Yehudi did malacha for you or for a Yisrael, it doesn't have to be for you. If an Eini Yehudi did malacha for a Yisrael on Shabbos, then a Yisrael is not allowed to enjoy the use or the benefit of that item until b'chtei sheyeyasu, after Shabbos. What does that mean? That means if somebody went ahead and you have a kosher Dunkin' Donuts that is in a heavily populated Yiddish town, and the Goyish proprietor knows that on Motzei Shabbos there's going to be a run on donuts. So now he went ahead and he baked a lot of donuts on Shabbos so that there should be plenty of donuts for his Jewish customers on Motzei Shabbos. So that's a case where an Eini Yehudi did malacha daraisa, he baked donuts, and he did it for the benefit of Yisraelim. And we'll see, even though there are non-Jews in the town as well, but he definitely had the Jewish customers in mind. He knows he gets a whole slew of Jewish customers on Motzei Shabbos. So he's baking those donuts for Yisraelim. In that case, you cannot walk in a minute after Ois and go ahead and buy a donut. Why? Because you have to wait ad b'chtei sheyeyasu. You have to wait enough time that if the Eini Yehudi wanted to do it after Shabbos, he would have had enough time to complete the malacha after Shabbos. You have to wait ad b'chtei sheyeyasu. But what the Mishnah Berurah is telling us over here is the only time you have to wait b'chtei sheyeyasu is when we know that the Eini Yehudi is doing the malacha on Shabbos for the benefit of Yisraelim. But when the Eini Yehudi does the malacha for himself, then it's asur on Shabbos. But it's not asur on Motzei Shabbos ad b'chtei sheyeyasu. Then you're allowed to enjoy it immediately after Shabbos. Aval kisha asur la'atzmai lo shayich limigzar. Okay, turning now to Sivav, 3 lines off the bottom. Says the Mechaber. So until now, in Sif Dalet and Sif Hey, we were talking about an Eini Yehudi who did malacha for his own purposes. He went ahead and he baked bread for himself. He went ahead and he caught fish for himself. He went ahead and he picked apples for himself. And now the question is, are you allowed to go ahead and enjoy the product of his malacha on Shabbos? And we see that there's a problem with muktzah. Largely, we have an issa d'Rabbanan going on over here because of muktzah. It's not really a problem that you can't enjoy the malacha of the Eini Yehudi. When the Eini Yehudi went down and caught fish on Shabbos, and we're telling you that you're not allowed to use that fish on Shabbos, it's not because, it was caught be'isser on Shabbos. It wasn't caught be'isser on Shabbos. The Eini Yehudi caught it on Shabbos. He's not doing an isser. For him, fishing is not also on Shabbos. He's allowed to go fishing on Saturday. So the driving force behind the Isser D'Rabbanan over here was not an Isser Malacha. The driving force behind the Isser has been a problem of Muktzah. The problem is that you want to go use that fish is Muktzah. Why? Because it was Muktzah during Ben Hashmashas. You want to go eat that apple? You want to be metaltal that apple? You can't. Why? Because it was Muktzah during Ben Hashmashas. You want to go ahead and eat that bread? So we saw at least one pshat. You can't eat that bread because it was Muktzah during Ben Hashmashas, or because it's Muktzah because of Noilid. So far what we've been dealing with over here is really an issue of Muktzah. Now in Sivav, we're going to change tracks a little bit. Now in Sivav, we're going to talk about an Eini Yehudi who does malacha for the benefit of a Yisrael. Now that's going to be a little bit of a different story. Let's take a look here in the Mechaber Sivav. Imliket v'tzad b'shvil Yisrael. Let's say the guy goes and he picks apples off the tree for you. He sees you eyeing those nice, beautiful, ripe apples on the tree, and he knows you can't pick one. He says, let me give you a couple of apples. He goes and he picks the apples, and now he picked it for you. Oy b'shvil Yisrael ve'eina Yehudi. Or maybe you have an Eini Yehudi that did malacha, and he did it not only for Yisraelim, he did it for Yisraelim and for Einam Yehudim. So that would be the case that I just gave you of the kosher Dunkin' Donuts in an out-of-town Jewish community where, if you'll go and you'll ask him on Shabbos why he's so hectic baking donuts, he's not going to tell you he's only doing it for the Jewish customers. He's doing it for all his customers. He's doing it for the Goyish customers. He's also doing it for the Yisraelim that are going to come in. So, Imliket v'tzad b'shvil Yisrael, or b'shvil Yisrael ve'eina Yehudi, tzarech lahamtin la'erev b'chtei sheyasu. Now you have a new problem. Now you have an Eini Yehudi who's doing malacha for a Yisrael. Once an Eini Yehudi is doing malacha for a Yisrael, the fruits of his labors do not become mutter the second Shabbos is over. Now you have to wait ad b'chtei sheyasu. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is kan chavav. Imliket v'tzad. Says the Mishnah Berurah, first of all, realize, we're not talking here about two isolated malachas. We're not talking here only about the malacha of Toilish and the malacha of Tzad. The same malacha applies to any time an Eini Yehudi performs Isurei Daraisa of Shabbos on behalf of a Yisrael. And realize that this is a problem, not only if the Yisrael looks at the guy and says, do me a favor, pick an apple. That would be Amir Lahakum. But not only that, even if, like I said, Tony sees you eyeing the ripe apples on the tree, and he sees that you want an apple. So you didn't ask him for it, you didn't tell him to do it, nothing. He said, let me give you a couple apples. He went and he did it all on his own, but he did it for you. Ayin Sham Beis Yosef. This is also a problem if he didn't do it only for Yisraelim. He did it for Yisraelim and Einam Yehudim. Kigoyin. Let's say you have that bakery in town where it's half and half. Half the population is Yidden, half the population is Goyim. So he didn't do it only for the Yisraelim, he did it for the Goyim also. Or even if it's not 50-50, even if 25% of the population is Yisraelim and 75% of the population is Einam Yehudim, but you know for a fact that the proprietor knows that he has to serve Jewish customers on Motzei Shabbos, so he's doing it for the Yiddish customers as well. After Haroiv Hayu Einam Yehudim, even if the Roiv is Einam Yehudim, it doesn't matter. And the Mishnah Berurah says he knows this. Now you have to wait for b'chdei sheyasu. Says the Mishnah Berurah, it's not only the one, if you could pinpoint him, it's not only the one that the Eini Yehudi did the malacha for, any Yisrael. So if Tony picked a few apples off the tree to give them to Ruvain, and Shimon wasn't even standing in the yard looking at the tree, those apples are also to Shimon ad b'chdei sheyasu as well. Kevan da asa malacha daraisa b'shvil Yisrael. Once an Eini Yehudi did malacha daraisa on behalf of a Yisrael, asur lakoil lehanois. It is asur for all Yisraelim to enjoy the benefits of that malacha ad motzei Shabbos b'chdei sheyasu, until after Shabbos is over and the period of time after that of b'chdei sheyasu. Or b'Shabbos gufa b'tiltel nami asur kib'sim b'tavkuf tezvav. On Shabbos itself, whatever he picks is going to be muktzeh and asur b'tiltel. V'lav dafka b'tzad, and again, this isn't isolated to the malacha of tzad, duadin or toilish, duadin b'chala malachis v'chanal. Now, V'hatam de asur lakoil ad b'chdei sheyasu. Why did the Chachamim make this gzera? Why is it that once the guy does malacha daraisa on Shabbos, it's usher to all Yisraelim until the Zman of B'chtei Sheyasu. Why? Explains the Mishnah Berurah, Shala yehanu mimalacha hanaseis b'shvil Yisrael b'Shabbos. We do not want Yisraelim getting hana from malacha that was done by an Eina Yehudi for Yisraelim on Shabbos. Because once we start allowing that, that's going to create problems. Like the Mishnah Berurah says, one reason is, V'gam de gazru de kashia mutter miyad b'motzai Shabbos. Well, no, before we get to that. For example, one problem is going to become, if we're going to allow Yisraelim to have hana from malacha that Einam Yehudim do on Shabbos, they're going to come to ask them to do it for them on Shabbos. And also, v'gam de gazru de kashia mutter miyad b'motzai Shabbos. Also another problem. If you're going to be able to eat the donuts the second Shabbos is over, so that means if you look at the calendar and you know that Shabbos is over at 7 o'clock, you expect to have a donut a minute after 7, right? Just the amount of time it takes you to get over to the donut store. So now what happens if you meet the Eina Yehudi proprietor of the donut store at 6 o'clock in the evening on Shabbos? You might tell him, hey, get ready, I'm going to be by you 7 o'clock for a donut. So now we're worried, Yom Eina Yehudi b'Shabbos, lahachin sheyem azumin al motzei Shabbos miyad. Once you're used to being able to eat that donut 30 seconds after Shabbos is over, you might come to instruct the Eina Yehudi on Shabbos to make sure that it should be ready immediately after Shabbos. Oiskan Chavtes, the Zman that we're talking about here, is known as B'chtei Sheyasu. What does this mean, B'chtei Sheyasu? Literally, the words mean the amount of time it would take to accomplish the task. Explains the Mishnah Berurah, Muvur l'kaman Siman Tavkuf Tezvav. Dahainu shir, this is the amount of time, sheyelecha Eina Yehudi b'motzai Shabbos l'mokom shalakat. So let's say we're talking about Tony picking apples off the tree. So Tony picked the apples off the tree. He wants to give them to you. You can't even take them because they're also betiltal. They're muktzah. So he brings them into your house and he puts them down on the kitchen table, and they're sitting on the kitchen table and you're salivating over them. When are you allowed to eat them on Motzei Shabbos? You're not allowed to eat them until Chtei Sheyasu. So what would be that amount of time in this case? What's called Chtei Sheyasu? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Dahainu shir, Sheyelech Eina Yehudi b'motzai Shabbos l'mokom shalakat. So, let's say Tony lives 2 blocks away from you. And let's say the apple tree is in your yard. So you have to wait the amount of time that it would take Tony to come from his house 2 blocks away to your yard where the apple tree is. And if he gave you 10 apples, you got to wait the amount of time it's going to take for him to pick 10 apples. And bring them to your house. So let's change up the case a little bit. The guy, Tony, lives 5 blocks away. Between your house and Tony's house, there's a park. The park has a delicious apple tree in it. You met Tony in the park on Shabbos afternoon. Tony picked the apples. Now on Motzei Shabbos, how much time do you have to wait? You have to wait the amount of time it would take for Tony to go from his house to the park, pick the 10 apples, bring them to your house, and give them to you. So if that's going to take 15 minutes, you have to wait 15 minutes after Motzei Shabbos to eat the apples. Now, what do you do if you don't know where the apple tree is? What if Tony just brought you apples, fresh picked apples on Shabbos, and you have no idea where he picked them? So how do you know how long B'chtei Sheyasu is? Says the Mishnah Berurah, in that case, then you have to wait for the amount of time it would take him to bring the apples from outside of the Tchum Shabbos. And if, let's say, at the beginning of Shabbos, Tony brought these apples on a horse, so then you take into consideration how long it would take him when he was riding on a horse. Now, another shaila. We have to deal with this whole Isser over here. We don't know, did the guy pick it on Shabbos? Did the guy not pick it on Shabbos? What if the guy tells you, Misiach lefi tumay, What does Mesiach Levituma means? Mesiach Levituma means something that the Eina Yehudi tells you completely innocently. He's not trying to be an Oiba Chacham. He's not trying to be smart. He just mentions to you when he brings you the apples. Boy, Ruvain, I got some beautiful apples for you. I'll tell you, I went to the You Pick farm yesterday on Erev Shabbos on Friday. Yesterday, Friday morning at 10 o'clock, I went to the You Pick farm and I picked these apples. And I know you love apples. I had you in mind. I picked you 10 apples. So now the guy just told you that he picked the apples on Erev Shabbos. And you could tell from the way he's telling it to you, he didn't tell it to you because he knows the halacha, and he knows that if you find out that he picked it on Shabbos, you're not going to eat it. He's just telling you, oh yeah, I had a great day yesterday. I went with the wife and kids to the You Pick farm, and I picked these apples. So Mesiach Levi Tumai, completely out of innocence, he told you that he picked it on Erev Shabbos. Are you allowed to believe him? If you could believe him, then the apples are mutter on Shabbos because they were picked on Erev Shabbos. So are you allowed to believe him? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ayin b'machakasav sham u'b'siman taf kof yud gimel, and over there the Ramah, I believe, says that if it's Mesiach Levitumai, and there's really no reason why he should be lying, and not only that, by lying he's actually making it worse for himself. Why should he tell you that he picked it yesterday, where it's less fresh, if he could tell you that he picked it today, where it's more fresh? So then the Ramah says you could believe him. Moving along to Siv Zayin. Says the Mechaber. Now let's deal with cases of Safek. Safek im likton b'shvil Yisrael. We don't know. The guy went there and picked these apples. We don't know. Did he pick them for himself or did he pick them for Yisrael? We don't know who he picked it for. Safek im likton b'shvil Yisrael, and obviously there has to be a Safek. Again, like we discussed earlier, it has to be that there's at least a tzad to say that he picked it for Yisrael. Not that you're just dreaming up. You know, you go somewhere out of town where there's not a Jew in sight, and you're going to say, I have a suffix. Did he pick it for a Goy or did he pick it for a Yisrael? No, there's no suffix. There has to be a suffix. You don't have a suffix. I don't know. Did he pick it for a Yid or did he pick it for an Eini Yehudi? So, suffix im likton b'shvil Yisrael, if we have a suffix if it was picked for a Yid, or maybe we know that it was picked for a Yid. But but we don't know, was it picked on Shabbos or was it picked before Shabbos? So now, let's do the math. Let's start with the first suffix. The first suffix was, we don't know if it was picked for a Yisrael or it was picked for an Eini Yehudi. Now, what's the difference in halacha if it was picked for an Eini Yehudi or it was picked for Yisrael? Even if it was picked for an Eini Yehudi on Shabbos, it's still usher. The difference between being picked the difference between being picked for Yisrael or being picked for an Eini Yehudi is only negeya on Motzei Shabbos. If it was picked for an Eini Yehudi, so then it becomes mutter immediately upon the end of Shabbos. If it was picked for Yisrael, it's aser until Chedei Sheyeh aser. So that's the whole nafkamina on the first suffix. The nafkamina of the second suffix is, we have a suffix, was it picked today or was it picked yesterday? Now, over there, it makes a very, 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 very big difference. If it was picked before Shabbos, it's completely mutter. If it was picked on Shabbos, it's aser. So again, says the Mechaber, we're dealing with two sveikas over here. Suffix im likton b'shvil Yisrael, let's say we have a suffix, if it was picked for Yisrael or a Yid. Or a new suffix. Sheyadua shalikton b'shvil Yisrael, maybe we know that the apples were picked for a Yid, but ve'eni yaduim nilkitu hayoyim lav. But we don't know, was it picked on Shabbos or was it picked before Shabbos? Says the Mechaber, Asurim by B'yoim, those apples are going to be Asur on Shabbos in both cases. So again, we have a suffix, Tony picked apples. We don't know if he picked it for a Yid or he picked it for a Goy. On Shabbos, the apples are Asur. And the truth is, that's very obvious. Because even if he picked it for a Goy, it's still Asur on Shabbos because it's still Muktzah. Right? Second suffix. We have a suffix. We know that these apples were picked for a Yid. But we don't know were they picked on Erev Shabbos or were they picked on Shabbos. Well, in that case, right, if we go on the tzad that it was picked before Shabbos, it would be mutter. If we go on the tzad that it was picked on Shabbos, it's aser. Says the Mechaber, we have to go l'chumrah. On Shabbos, it's definitely going to be aser. V'la Erev, and as far as Motzei Shabbos, we're also going l'chumrah. It's aser until Kedei Sheyeh Asu. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Lam. Safik im Liktan. Kigon. The Mishnah Berurah gives us a beautiful example of what it means that you have a suffix. Was it picked for a yid or was it picked for a goy? Like I told you, it has to be a real suffix. Explains the Mishnah Berurah. Kigon, for example. Shoyeni Yehudi Amal Yisrael Litan Le Paris B'Shabbos. Tony told Ruvain, hey Ruvain, tomorrow is your Shabbos. I'm going to have some gorgeous, unbelievably sweet blueberries for you to snack on Shabbos afternoon. Come to me on Shabbos. I'm going to give you the most delicious blueberries you ever tasted. Okay. V'halach lebeis ein Yehudi. So now Reuven goes to the Ein Yehudi's house on Shabbos afternoon. V'nasa le'peiros. And Tony gives him the blueberries. Now, does Reuven know when Tony picked the blueberries? He doesn't know. Safik im likait elu bishviloi. Is it pshat that Tony just went out to the yard and just picked these delicious blueberries for Reuven? Oi chashav lilkait acherim bishviloi. Or maybe the elu likait la'atzmai mitchila. Or maybe Tony picked these blueberries on Erev Shabbos for himself. And he figured that at some point on Shabbos afternoon, he's going to go out and pick blueberries for Reuven. But he didn't yet. And Reuven just showed up. So now he's giving Reuven blueberries that he picked for himself on Erev Shabbos. So that's a case where you have a suffix. I don't know. Tony told me I should come Shabbos and get delicious blueberries. So I came on Shabbos to pick up the blueberries. He's got the blueberries sitting on the kitchen table. I don't know when he picked them. Maybe he just picked them now to give them to me, or maybe no. Maybe he wanted to have blueberries also. And the blueberries for himself, he already picked yesterday. He's giving them away. Yeah, he's giving them away, because the minute I leave the house, he could go out to the field and he could pick himself new blueberries. So I have a suffix. But now the Mishnah Berurah says, I'll give you another case where there is no room for a suffix. If Tony shows up to your house on Shabbos afternoon and he says, look, I have a beautiful present for you. You got to taste these unbelievably sweet blueberries. Lo, you have a suffix. Then the Chavetz Chaim says, you don't have a suffix. If he's coming to bring you a present, he's bringing you the freshest blueberries he has. He definitely just picked them. Also, Tony shows up at your house with a hot loaf of bread. Certainly, there's going to be no suffix. Did he bake it for you or did he bake it for somebody else? He's coming to deliver you a steaming hot loaf of bread. He baked it for you. There's no suffix. He brings this down from the Magen Avram and the Tosefet Shabbos. We have a suffix over here. We don't know. Maybe we know that he picked the apples for Yisrael, but we don't know. Did he pick them today or did he pick them yesterday? Says the Mishnah Berurah. Again, this is not talking about a case where the Ein Yehudi is bringing you a gift on Shabbos. The Behevi Doirin, if he's bringing you a gift, a Hevi Limkar, or he's giving it to you as a sale, we would assume that he picked it on Shabbos. Because he's going to bring the best schora, that the freshest that he picked today. Asurim bayom v'lo erev. So in both of these cases, in case number one, where you have a suffix whether the parents were picked for Yisrael or they were picked for an Ein Yehudi, or case number two, we know that they were picked for Yisrael, so we know that they're usher, but we don't know we know that they were picked for Yisrael, but we don't know whether they picked today or whether they picked before Shabbos. In both cases, the Mechaber said they're usher by bayom, and they're also usher on Moshe Shabbos until K'dei Sheyoyasu. V'atam, and the reason is, says the Mishnah Berurah, the asru misafik af shehu milsa derabanan desveika lekula. And this is the Mishnah Berurah that I referenced earlier. The Mishnah Berurah says, even though over here we're dealing with cases of suffik, and we're dealing with a din derabanan, and you would think to apply the rule of sveika derabanan lekula, over here we do not say sveika derabanan lekula. Why? Mishum dehu davar sheyesh lo matirin she'efshar lahamtin on Motzei Shabbos. Because we're dealing with muktzah. Muktzah is a davar sheyesh lo matirin. It becomes automatically mutter upon the end of Shabbos. So why should we employ a heter? Now, interesting question, says the Mishnah Berurah. V'im hayu shtei asveikos biyachad. In the Mechaber and Siv Zayin, we were talking about two different scenarios. Two different sveikos. Suffix number one was, we have a case the guy picked blueberries. We don't know. Did he pick it for himself or did he pick it for Yisrael? But we know that he picked them on Shabbos. What's our shaila? Our shaila is if he picked them for himself, they're aser, but they become mutter immediately upon the end of Shabbos. If he picked them for Yisrael, they're also aser, but in that case, not only are they aser on Shabbos, they're aser ad b'chdei sheyasu on Motzei Shabbos. That was case number one. The Mechaber Paskind over there, we got to go l'chumrah. What does it mean we got to go l'chumrah? Well, they're aser on Shabbos. That's not a chumrah, because on either tzad of the suffix, they're aser on Shabbos. Whether he picked them for himself or he picked them for Yisrael, they're aser on Shabbos. But we have to go l'chumrah on Motzei Shabbos, and we have to say that they're aser ad b'chdei sheyasu. That was case number one. Case number two was a different case. Case number two was, we know that the blueberries were picked for a Yid, but we don't know when they were picked. Were they picked before Shabbos, in which case they're mutter legamri, or were they picked on Shabbos, in which case they're aser, and they're aser ad b'chdei sheyasu. Said the Mechaber, we got to go l'chumrah. They're aser on Shabbos, and they're aser on Motzei Shabbos ad b'chdei sheyasu. Now the Mishnah Berurah puts forth another shaila. What if you have a case where you have both sveikas? Suffix number one, im Tloshen b'Shabbos. We don't know were these blueberries picked on Shabbos or were they picked before Shabbos. The gam, and furthermore, im Tloshen b'Shvil HaYisrael. Even if they were picked on Shabbos, we also don't know were they picked for a goy or were they picked for a yid. Says the Mishnah Berurah, b'Shabbos gufa aser. On Shabbos itself, it's going to be aser. Why? Explains the Mishnah Berurah. What you're trying to do over here is you're trying to create a case of svek sveika. Usually when we have a double suffix, that's a very strong reason to be matir. So you want to create a case over here where you have a svek sveika. We have a double suffix on these blueberries. We don't know if they were picked on Shabbos or they were picked before Shabbos. We don't know if they were picked for a yid or they were picked for a goy. Maybe we have a svek sveika, maybe they become mutter. Says the Mishnah Berurah, as far as whether or not these blueberries should be mutter or aser on Shabbos, do the math. You don't have a svek sveika. The ha'afilu vaday loy b'shvil Yisrael loktan aser b'Shabbos b'shum suffix muchan. Let's do the math. Let's say that we have a suffix. Was it picked for a yid or was it picked for a goy? So you know what? We'll go ahead and we'll go l'kula. Let's pretend that bevadai it was picked for a goy. So what? That doesn't help us as far as Shabbos is concerned, because even if the guy picked it for himself, it's still also on Shabbos. So do you have a double suffix? Do you have a svek sveika of what the halacha should be on Shabbos? No. Even if it was picked for a goy, it's also on Shabbos. So the only suffix you have is, maybe it wasn't picked on Shabbos. Maybe it was picked before Shabbos. But that's a single suffix. And since it's a davar sheyesh lam atirin, we go l'chumrah. So as far as Shabbos itself, it's definitely also on Shabbos. Turning the page, continues the Mishnah Berurah, and he says, Kanal b'sifei, avo b'motzei Shabbos, but on Motzei Shabbos, yesh lahater b'zeh miyad, b'shom svek sveika. But as far as the status of these blueberries on Motzei Shabbos, now you have a svek sveika, because do the math. Look at the blueberries on Motzei Shabbos. When you look at the blueberries on Motzei Shabbos, you have a double suffix. Suffix number one, I don't know if these blueberries were picked on Shabbos or before Shabbos. If they were picked before Shabbos, they're mutter legamri. If they were picked on Shabbos, they're aser. Okay, but now I'm talking about Motzei Shabbos b'chdei sheyasu. Who were they picked for? If they were picked for a goy on Shabbos, they're mutter miyad on Motzei Shabbos. So on that side, they're mutter right away. If they were picked for Yisrael, they're also b'chdei sheyasu. But we have a suffix whether or not they were picked on Shabbos and they're also at all. So here you have a svek sveika. So as far as Motzei Shabbos is concerned, you could be matter them miyad b'Motzei Shabbos. And that concludes today's share. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Discussing limud HaTorah should be megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shem Shesen Yeshua's reforce Parnasim Sheduchim Tol Ozanid. We should be zeicher to see the Bias Kal Tzedek. B'mher v'yameinu Amen. Be well.